A recently published book, The Real Cowboys and Aliens, UFO Encounters of the Old West, goes beyond the glamour and glitz of Hollywood and tells true stories of alien encounters in the 1800s. Our presenter, Mr. Stephen Andrasko, is a researcher and author who speaks frequently at UFO conferences, including mine, and is an award-winning storyteller. He holds a master's degree from the University of North Texas in Denton. Please welcome Mr. Stephen Andrasko. Steve. I dared him to wear a cowboy hat. I see he didn't. Anyway, I'll get even with him later. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Here's Steve.
Now, my wife bought me this shirt just to wear, so if you see her, tell her I wore her shirt that she bought me. Okay, well, I'm here to take the place of David, who couldn't come, and so you're not going to hear about Star Trek tonight. I work with Noe. I've worked at the same library as Noe for this is my 9th year that we've worked together, but we've known each other for about 20 years, and so I've been around when he first started writing, and his first couple of books were about baseball. And that's really his first love, is baseball, and he likes to go to baseball games. But he started collecting some stories about the Rio Grande Valley, and I liked going to tell stories to kids about chupacabras and other stories in the Rio Grande Valley. And that's where he collected this story about a UFO that crashed not far from here. And as he began doing his research, he ran across others that were doing research on that, which is Ruben, who's at the airport right now in San Antonio picking up George Norrie. And so from that, I began meeting people that were interested in the UFO thing. So once in a while, Ruben comes out, and if he comes in the summer, we like to go to baseball games. And so one time if you're at the baseball game, you're free to talk about whatever you want. And what a better place to go to talk about UFOs than to sit in the baseball stadium, and you can sit and talk. Well, we went to this baseball game to see the Rangers and the Yankees, and when we were there, lo and behold, 3 nuns came and sat down right in front of us. And what was worse, they were Yankees fans. And they had on these big habits that they wear, so they were kind of blocking our view. So Noe and Ruben said, well, maybe if we keep talking about UFOs, they'll get annoyed and leave. So we kept discussing different UFO stories and new things that we had learned, and sure enough, that didn't bother them. They didn't leave. So we thought if we annoyed them enough, they would move to another area and we could see. So Ruben says, I think I'm going to go back to California. There's only a couple dozen nuns in the whole state. Well, that didn't bother him. And so Noe says, well, I think I'll go to Louisiana. I heard there's only like a dozen nuns live there. No reaction from him. So I said, well, I think I'm going to go to Utah, up in Salt Lake City. I think there's only 1 or 2 nuns in the whole state. Well, one of the nuns turned around and said, well, why don't you just go to hell? There's no nuns living there. So we had a good laugh, and so we moved a couple of rows up where we could get a better view and began talking about our favorite thing, UFOs and that sort of thing. And about the time that this movie came out about aliens and cowboys, Noe had been doing some research, and not like the 133,000 documents that are released, but research looking at old newspaper clippings, going through archives online of old newspapers, and trying to collect some stories about UFO sightings in the Old West. Now, many people believe that UFOs weren't sighted till, in the 1940s, where you had the Roswell incident, and it was all in the newspaper, or in the radio, television, and things like that. But it really began, when men first began looking up into the skies. Now, nowadays, we don't get to look up at the Milky Way too much because I think east of the Mississippi, you can't even see the Milky Way anymore with the naked eye. There's just too much light pollution. So you have to go out to the west. And last October, when we were in Presidio, they had a stargazing party at the Fort Leaton there, and you could gaze up at the sky there down on the Big Bend and see the Milky Way and many of the planets and things. So the old cowboys, you know, would go out, and as they were doing their cattle drives or just working out on the ranches, they'd gaze into the sky and see, you know, all kinds of things. I mean, even in the Bible, Ezekiel saw, you know, a flying wheel that landed and took off in front of him. Many recordings of early explorers crossing the Atlantic, seeing strange sights and recording what they had seen. And even some Renaissance painters depicted some strange flying crafts in some of their paintings, as well as pictographs and early Indian drawings. The Aztecs and Mayas had flying serpents and different things that they describe in their culture and their myths. So we're going to start We're going to go ahead and start in 1864. This is much after the 1947 Roswell crash. Now here's a picture of the authors of the book, which I'm going to tell some of the stories from. And of course there's Noe and John LeMay, and they're actually out at the UFO crash site there in New Mexico. Now, do we know that cowboys saw UFOs? Well, Hollywood has their kind of version of what it would be like if cowboys and aliens met. And their version looks a little bit like this. And of course, you have good guys and bad guys in every cowboy movie. Used to, you could tell the good guys because they had the white hats, and the bad guys wore the dark hats. But in today's movies, it's a little more complicated than that. I don't think it'll matter. I'm just going to go through it. Now, it looks pretty exciting in the movies. But in the Albuquerque Journal, after the movie was released, they wrote a little article that said, hey, Hollywood, if you're going to make a big budget movie about ETs in the Wild West, can't you at least get it right? Of course, spacemen explored our planets in the days of lawmen and saloon doors, but was it the cartoonish picture of evil planetary invaders, complete with hideous teeth and slimy hands and their reptilian bellies? Well, in the book, Real Cowboys and Aliens, the record is set straight, using information from old newspaper clippings to tell numerous and very interesting encounters between farmers and cowboys and their mysterious visitors in flight. So they did a little book review of the Real Cowboys and Aliens. And so now we're going to hear some of the true stories as recorded by eyewitnesses in the Old West. Now, in the Rocky Mountains, there was a mountain man, trapper, name of James Lumley. And he was out for trapping in Montana, up in the Teton area, when he witnessed a UFO crash. That shows a little place, the area where he was out fur trapping. And as he was out, he heard a swishing sound, a kind of a whirring, like a wind sound in the sky, and he looked up and he saw this bright light coming towards him, and it was coming at a very extremely fast speed. And as it got closer and closer, it exploded, and a tremendous wind passed like a hurricane. He describes it as a hurricane. And the earth shook, and there was a loud explosion. And of course, this was at night, and so he was unable to see exactly what it was that caused this great catastrophe. So next morning, he went out in search of what had caused this to happen. And he was very surprised, just a few miles from where he was camped, as he got closer to what had caused this disturbance. He noticed that there was a great swath of trees had been just completely blown over, the tops knocked off of them, and places in the ground which were dug up like, a huge giant plow had come through the area. And as he got closer, he found a huge, looked like a burnt rock that was stuck in the ground. And that's what he thought it was. He thought, well, it's got to be a meteorite that fell from the sky. And as he got closer and observed the object that he was looking at, well, he discovered that it wasn't a stone, but it was some kind of a craft or something, some kind of device that was divided into compartments in which he could enter. And so as he entered into these different compartments, he noticed on the sides of the walls of some of the compartments that he entered was some very strange writing, which he described looking like what he thought would be Egyptian hieroglyphics. And so later he told his story to some people, and it was reported in the Cincinnati commercial about what he had saw. They said that, strange as the story appears, Mr. Lumley relates it with so much sincerity that we're forced to accept that it is true. And so after interviewing him and listening to his remarkable tale, they published that story. It says, interestingly enough, it was, I guess, about 35 years later that H.G. Wells published his book, of course, The War of the Worlds. And in that book, the first spaceship that appears also looks like a burnt rock of some kind that has landed. And it's not until the aliens unscrew the top of this craft and come out that they discover that it's not a meteor, but that it's a spaceship with visitors from another. So Mr. Lumley was one of the first to have his eyewitness statements recorded and published in the newspaper. Now, about 10 years later, an interesting occurrence occurred in Kansas and also not too far away in the south, in the state of Texas. And in this story, people saw and observed what they described as a flying serpent. It was recorded in the Fort Scott Monitor, and then later it was recorded in the New York Times. People saw an enormous serpent that seemed to float like a cloud. Okay, the sighting that they described looked like a giant snake that was undulating in the sky, that breathed fire, and it was traveling at a very slow and undulating speed. It said in the New York Times that they commented also about the people reporting this, and they said that a few years later, or earlier, people in Kansas had reported, or Nebraska had reported the same type of sighting. And so many people saw it that they put it into a song. They wrote a folk song about it. And one of the verses says, there was a serpent, a flying engine with no wing or wheel. It came a-roaring in the sky with lights along the side and scales like a serpent's hide. Well, some people say this sounds more like a UFO than a snake flying through the sky, but many cultures have flying serpents in their legends and stories, including the Aztecs, of course, which had the serpent god Quetzalcoatl was one of their main gods that they worshipped. So these incidents remain a mystery, and later we'll see another very similar type of sighting in Indiana. Now, just a few years later, okay, this story happens near Dallas, and it's actually the first time that someone used the word as a saucer to describe the UFO that they saw. Okay, now, this farmer, his name was John Martin, and he was out one day when he saw what he described as an upside-down saucer that was about the size of an orange, and it was coming towards him, and as it came with great speed, it got closer and closer and got larger and larger. In the Denison Daily News, it was described, and they confirmed that Martin was a very trustworthy person, that he was not the kind of person who would make up a false story. He's a gentleman in undoubted veracity, and his strange occurrence, if it was not a balloon, deserves the attention of our scientists. So hot air balloons were invented in those days, but what he describes is anything but being a hot air balloon. And of course, one of my favorite stories about unusual phenomenon is located not far from here. How many of you have been out to see the Marfa lights? Okay, for the first time I saw them just a couple of years ago, and then last October we stopped to see them again. And these lights have been seen and recorded being seen since the 1800s. I'm sure they've been seen many times before that. And sometimes they're called the ghost lights or the Apache lights. And they're so famous that the state of Texas has actually built a viewing area there where you could stop along the highway at night and watch the lights come out. And there are many folk tales and stories that surround this unusual occurrence of these lights. These are some pictures that Noe took just a couple of summers ago with his camera that shows some of the lights appearing there off into the mountains, looking down towards the Presidio and towards the Rio Grande River from the viewing area. This is a little laser experiment that one of the paranormal groups did when they were there, and they would point the laser at the lights, and the lights would sometimes go out, or they would split into many other lights. And using their night vision goggles, like we would look and we'd see 2 or 3 lights, but when you put on those goggles, you'd see dozens of those lights that didn't appear with the naked eye. This is a picture of the viewing station. If you have never been out that way, you can go out there, and usually the lights begin to appear not too long after dark, but a lot of times it's later in the night where they really become active. Let's go back a second here. Well, one of the first attempts to figure out what they were was an engineer named Walter Harris, and he went out, he was surveying in the area, and he saw the lights, and he thought that maybe it was some guys camping out there or some Indians that had lit campfires, and so they went out towards the mountains there where the lights appear, and they found nothing. And they attempted to go out in the daytime and look around for campfires and that, and the lights were so bright, they figured it must have been large fires, but found no evidence. So they continued to do that for 3 nights and never discovered anything. Then there was a cowboy named Robert Reed Ellison who was herding cattle, who also decided he was going to ride out there with his horses and find out what was there. He had went many nights in a row on horseback with his men to try to get close to the lights and see what they were, and was never able to discover the source of those lights. There's been many TV shows and experiments by different colleges and things to try to determine what causes those lights. And there are many stories that go along with it. Some say it's a ghost of an Indian chief named Alzate, who used to conduct raids across the border into Mexico, and the Mexican government got very upset, and they finally captured and killed him and rounded up his men and sold them all off into slavery to try to stop him from going into the villages in Mexico and raiding and stealing chickens and horses and things like that. And they say that, some of the stories say that it's the ghost of Alzate. But one of the stories I like is a story of a blacksmith that was in the area there, and his name was John. And there's many different versions of this story, but John, he started out as a real nice guy. And of course, blacksmiths were very looked upon profession in those days, because if you needed a tool fixed, you needed a shovel fixed, or you needed your horse shoed, you went to the blacksmith. Well, he was kind of a mean old guy as he got older and older, and people would quit going to see him because he was just mean, and he liked to play jokes on people. So they would only go to see him when it was absolutely necessary. So when people stopped going to see him, he would go out and invite people in, because he liked to play tricks on people. So sometimes he'd go out and invite people in for dinner, and then after he was feeding them, he'd play some kind of mean joke on them or trick on them. And so the story goes, one cold winter day, he went out, and there was an old man walking around, old gray-haired man with a long beard, and so he invited him in to eat, because he looked pretty old and kind of crippled. And so as he came in, he cooked him up some soup and began to feed him, and he thought, well, this guy's kind of old, maybe I shouldn't play a trick on him or be mean to him. So he fed him and began to talk with him. And as he fed him, the man's appearance began to change. He began to grow. His hair got shorter, his beard got shorter, and he grew taller, and he noticed he had on old raggedy clothes that turned into kind of a robe, and around his neck was a chain with some keys. And so old Wicked John said, well, what the heck is going on? Who are you? And he said, well, if you ever went to church, you might know who I am. I'm St. Peter. And I come down here on earth once a year, and if somebody does anything kind for me, I give them 3 wishes, and I grant them. And so old Wicked John began to think, and he said, 3 wishes. I could do a lot of mischief with that. And so he says, okay. He says, for my first wish, you see my favorite rocking chair over there? Well, there's always some lazy bum coming in sitting in my rocking chair, and when I'm tired, I like to sit there. He says, I wish that when someone sits in that chair, it grabs a hold of them and it rocks until I tell it to stop. And St. Peter said, gosh, that's an awful strange wish. Don't you want gold or a mansion or new horses or something? No. He says, well, what do you want for a second wish? And John said, well, you see my hammer over there? I use that to make my living. But a lot of times I go to get my hammer and it's gone. Some kids are out pounding rocks or something with it. So anybody picks up my hammer, I want that hammer to grab a hold of them and pound until I tell it to stop. So St. Peter said, That's just absurd. What kind of wish is that? But it's your wish. And he said, what's your last wish? He said, well, look outside the door of the shop. You see that old scraggly thorn bush out there? That used to have the prettiest yellow roses you ever saw. But the kids are always coming and picking it, and it really upsets me. He says, I wish that anybody that gets near that bush, it grabs a hold of them and it sticks them with those thorns until I tell it to stop. So St. Peter said, all right, those are your wishes. So he floated off into the sky and disappeared. Well, old John didn't get any nicer, and so he just kept doing mean things. Well, pretty soon the devil found out about him, how mean he was. And he says, I think it's time that guy comes down here. His days are numbered anyway. So he sent his youngest son up to get John, and John went up he went up to visit John, and he appeared at the door, and John says, who are you? He says, I'm the son of the devil, and he sent me up here to get you. He says, well, I got plenty of work to do here. I'm not going. He says, well, you're going whether you like it or not. And John says, all right, I'll go. I got to finish this horseshoe. Why don't you go sit down in that chair over there and relax for a little while? Well, the young devil sits in there, and the chair grabs a hold of him, and it rocks him and rocks him and rocks him and rocks him until he's so dizzy he's going to throw up. And he says, stop. So John says, all right, but only if you leave and never come back here to bother me again. I promise, he said. So he said, stop, chair, and it stopped, and off he went. Well, when the devil heard that, he said, gosh, that guy is mean. He says, he sent his oldest son this time. Go on up there and get John, bring him down here, and don't take no for an answer. So he goes up there, same kind of thing. And John's like, well, who are you? I'm coming to get you. My dad sent me. He said, all right, why don't you have a seat in that chair over there? He said, I'm not sitting in that chair. He said, well, I can't go yet. I still have some work to do. Could you bring me my hammer so I could finish this horseshoe? So the little devil grabbed a hold of the hammer, and the hammer grabbed a hold of him and began to pound and pound and pound until his arm was so long and tired and stretched out, and he couldn't stand it anymore. And he said, please make it stop. And John said, all right, but only if you leave and never come back and bother me again. And so he promised. John said, stop, hammer. It stopped. So he went back down. His arm was all hanging down. He was just in such sad shape, and the devil saw that, and he says, I guess I'm going to have to take things into my own hands. So with a cloud of dust, smoke, and fire, he appeared in the blacksmith shop. He says, all right, John, you're coming with me. He says, I can't. Why don't you sit in that chair? And the devil says, I'm not going to sit in there. Well, bring me my hammer so I can finish my work. I'm not falling for that. So they began to circle each other, and they got in a big wrestling match, and there was dust and screaming and yelling, and pretty soon the dust smoked, and the devil had old John by the legs. He says, now I'm going to give you a whooping you're never going to forget. So he went out to that thorn bush to grab himself a branch off of there, and when he did, the bush grabbed him and pulled him right in and began to stick him, and thorns everywhere, and he was screaming and yelling, and John was laughing, and finally the devil gave up and said, okay, let me go. And he said, all right, but only if you promise, and don't bother me again. So he made the promise, and the devil was beat. He didn't get John's soul. Well, it wasn't too long after that John actually died. So when he died, he went up to heaven, and there was St. Peter, and St. Peter says, what are you doing up here? He says, well, I'm dead. I'm come to rest. He said, you're not coming up here. You're too mean. You got to go down. You got to go down to hell. He said, all right. So he began his descent down, and as he was going down to hell, he passed the first little devil, and he saw him. He says, oh my gosh, it's John. So he ran through the gates, and he told his brother, John's a-coming, lock the gates. So they locked the gates there to hell, and when John got there, he knocked on the gates, and the devil came out and said, what do you want? He says, well, I went up to see St. Peter, and he wouldn't let me in, so where else am I supposed to go? He said, well, you're not coming in here, that's for sure. And John said, well, where can I go then? If I can't go to heaven, then I can't go to hell. And he says, I don't care, go back to Texas. So John said, oh, okay, I guess I will. And as he turned around, those two little devils each picked up a big ball of fire and threw them over the fence and hit John in the back. He grabbed those balls of fire and he was going to throw them back. He said, what the heck? I'll just take them with me. And so the story goes that if you go out there west of Marfa at night and you look out off into the mountains towards Presidio, if you look long enough, you'll see old Wicked John walking down the sides of the mountain carrying those two big balls of fire. And that's the version of the Marfa lights that I like the best. So there's many a legend on how those Marfa lights came about. Well, now there are other interesting stories besides Marfa lights and lights in the sky. And another one was about some cowboys that lived about the time of old John. And these guys, they were up near Binkelman, Nebraska, and they were out, like many cowboys, tending to their cattle. And according to the Nebraska Nugget and the Daily State Journal of Lincoln, Nebraska, these cowboys were in a roundup when they were interrupted, again, similar to the other story, by a terrific whirring noise. And they looked up in the sky and they saw an airship they described as cylindrical, 50 to 60 feet long and 10 to 12 feet wide. And this ship was coming down, and it said that, again, they described him and his men as being well-known ranchmen. They were going out to herd in the annual roundup when they heard this terrific rushing noise of wind, and they thought they saw a blazing meteor of immense size falling to the earth. They didn't see it actually crash, so they went off into the over the hill to see where this crashed. As they rode up, they saw fragments of cog wheels and other pieces of fine machinery lying upon the ground. They took a shovel and they tried to pick up a fragment of one of the wheels, which was so hot they could not touch it. They picked it up. It says it had a milled rim, apparently having the diameter of 7 to 8 feet. It seemed to be the same material as other small pieces they saw and was of remarkable lightness. So as large as it was, they were able to lift it very easily. They came to the edge of a deep ravine in which the strange object had fallen, and they undertook to see what it was. But the heat was so great and the light so blazing that the naked eye could not rest upon it for more than a moment. Unfortunately, one of the cattlemen, who's interesting, his name is Alf, like Robin Williams when he played that crazy Mork and Mindy was named Alf. But this guy's name was Alf Williamson. And he tried to get close to the object. It says, within 30 seconds, he fell senseless from gazing at it at too close of corners. His hair was singed to a crisp and his face covered with blisters. So they dragged the injured man back and took him back to his ranch where his brother was called from Denver to come and get him. So this is kind of one of the first recorded incidents of someone being injured or harmed that involved a UFO crash. Was it from the heat? Was it from radiation? We don't know. But what's more interesting about this story is that the news of this crash spread and people began to come from all around. And a lot of people came to observe what had happened. And right about that time, a tremendous storm came through the area, a tremendous rainstorm in which the people that were there had to go back to their homes and they couldn't get close enough to see. And they were hoping that the rainstorm would put the heat and the fire of this thing out so they could get close to observe it. But some of them stayed to watch. And it says it was impossible to see more than a rod through the driving, blinding mass, which the rainstorm lasted for over half an hour. When it slackened, they should have been able to see the craft visible, but it was no longer there. It had washed away. I guess the metal was so light that the rain had washed it away down the ravine. Astounding, they were able to see that the queer object seemed to them to have melted. All that was left was a spoonful of gooey, jelly-like substances that were there. It grew thinner and thinner until it was nothing left but some muddy water that washed away into the current of the running rainwater. So the object that they came to see that was so large and so light, the sudden rainstorm washed it away down the ravine and down, I guess, into the river. And nothing was left but some goo that they saw that disappeared with the rain. What really happened to it? Did it melt away or was it washed away with the rain? Well, nobody really knows, but the way they described the pieces of it, they used terminology that they, used in those days as tremendous cogwheels and pieces of metal that were strewn about the area. This is kind of the area that it was located in where it crashed. Now, Bigfoot. What does that got to do with the UFOs? Or does it have any connection to UFOs? Well, this story happens in Humboldt County, California, which is up in big redwood country. If you've ever been up that, the Jedediah Smith Redwoods, the state park, one of my favorite places to go camping as a young man. And this is an interesting story because it's about a man who befriended the Indian tribe that lived up there, and he was recording kind of their culture, their language, their way of life. And while he was there, this Mr. Wyatt, while he was there and taking his notes, he discovered that some local tribesmen each evening would take a big platter of meat away from the village they lived in and off into the forest. So after a while of observing this, he began to be curious, and he decided that he would follow them on their journey, what they were doing. As he did, the tribesmen were very reluctant for him to follow them. They didn't want him to go with them. But after a while of him having lived with them, they let him go with them on their trip. What he came across was very interesting. Inside a cave, there sat a very strange creature, cross-legged on the floor. And they were bringing him this platter of raw meat each evening for him to eat. It says the tribesmen took him to a high rock pinnacle later and told him that men came down from the sky in a small moon and dropped off several of these hairy creatures. And that in the past, this had happened many times. The local tribesmen described these creatures as crazy bears. And they said that one time that they came down, they dropped off, and they could see inside this small silver moon men that looked sort of human-like, and that they even waved to the tribesmen before they closed the door to their spaceship and flew away. So, according to this tribe, these creatures were brought to Earth in this small craft of some kind and left there for the tribesmen to take care of. The tribesmen thought that they had some kind of magic, and they thought it was their duty to take care of these crazy bears. Now, Mr. Wyatt records that he only observed one of these crazy bears, and then he only mentions it the one time in his diary. He doesn't mention that he ever went back and whatever happened to the crazy bear. But there are many stories of Bigfoot sightings that kind of correspond to UFO sightings in different areas of the country. In fact, I saw on the news the other day, they had some pictures in Arizona of some roadside cameras or something that took pictures of what looked like a whole family of Bigfoots crossing the highway. But they couldn't, nobody could really identify what these creatures were. Because normally you don't see a whole family of bears crossing a highway in Arizona. So what exactly was it that they were seeing? So that's a very interesting story that kind of comes to us from Mr. Wyatt in California. I don't know how I'm doing on my time. Let me check. Okay, I'm doing pretty good. Well, another interesting story, it's not of Bigfoot, but it's of a giant bird. This happened in 1890 outside of Tombstone, Arizona, by some cowboys that were riding there. And they described this giant prehistoric-looking bird. According to the Tombstone epitaph, it said that these cowboys riding saw an exhausted creature with a huge pair of wings, resembling a huge alligator with extremely elongated tail and immense pair of wings. The creature was evidently greatly exhausted from some long flight. So the cowboys began to try to get closer, look at it, but their horses were too afraid. So they began to get closer and it took off flying again. So they chased after it again, but apparently it seemed to be exhausted and not able to fly very far. So they followed it after it landed a second time, and of course they began shooting at it. After many shots fired into the creature, it fell over dead. When they got up to it, they said that the creature measured 92 feet in length, had only 2 feet, and his head was 8 feet long with strong jaws lined with sharp teeth. Its wings were folded under its dead body, and so it was difficult to measure the wings. But they estimated the wings to be 160 feet from wingtip to wingtip. It was featherless and hairless, and the wings were made of some kind of thick, transparent membrane. The skin was very smooth and could be cut off easily. And so the men sliced pieces of the wing membrane and took it with them. It said they arrived in the city for supplies to take their necessary preparations to skin the creature, where the creature's hide will be sent back east for examination. But after that, it never says what happened. If the men went back, skinned the creature, or what they did with the creature's skin. And that was recorded in the epitaph. Well, later somebody said there was a picture of men, there was a photograph of men that actually standing behind a giant bird. But these men, the bird was only about 36 feet in length, and the picture shows that it was of some kind of bird that actually had feathers. So it's not really the same creature that was described earlier by the Tombstone epitaph. It said that they had 9 cowboys standing arm to arm with the creature behind them. Now, Noe tried to find, through all the research they did, this picture that was described, but was never able to find it. Now, many cultures have stories of birds, giant birds, or birds that carry off, giant eagles that come down and take their chihuahua and fly off or whatever. But even the famous pioneer Daniel Boone claims to have witnessed what he called a Thunderbird come down and pick up a 5-year-old Indian boy and fly away. It says that the Indians fired several arrows into the monster with no effect, and that the boy was never seen again. So there are many stories of giant birds called Thunderbirds. One of the tribes, I think the Hopis, have stories of Thunderbirds of a giant bird that was struck by lightning and began to glow, and that's where he got where they got the name of Thunderbird. And so they believed that the giant bird would fly across the sky and cause lightning and thunder. And there are several stories of UFOs in early Texas newspapers. One is of one that was spotted by people in Dublin, Texas on a Sunday, and it exploded over a flour mill in the town. What's interesting about this is there was a reverend and his wife that went out, and they found among the wreckage of this spacecraft were scraps of paper written with, like earlier accounts, of a strange hieroglyphic writings, and that he was so excited that he would not talk to the newspaper reporter. Said he worked himself up in such a pitch of excitement he would not answer any more questions or show any more of the wreckage to the reporter or talk to him any more about it. So he took his souvenirs that he gathered from this crash, and this is the crash site where that happened today. They still have remnants of the grist mill, the cotton gin, and some other of the early buildings that were in that area of the crash. Now, the Crawfordsville flying monster happened in Indiana, and a very similar, and it happened, and 3 or 4 men saw this. They saw this giant long creature that they described as having scales like fish and an eye, one single blazing eye in the front, and it made tremendous screeching noises as it flew. Well, people laughed at him and thought it was funny until the next night when over 100 people in the town saw the same thing that they described, flying over the cornfields outside of their town of Crawfordsville, Indiana. Now, other people later described, well, maybe it was a giant flock of birds that sometimes would fly. But I think in those days, settlers know the difference between birds and what could you describe as a giant flaming eye in the front of this unusual appearance that they saw 2 nights in a row. This story has also been on several TV shows about UFOs. And finally, we have the underwater UFO. This happened up in the Puget Sound area of Washington when some men were out on a surveying expedition and some other men were out on a fishing and hunting expedition, the same area, different groups of men. And that night they were out and they were asleep at night and they heard this unusual hissing sound, and the hair on their heads began to stand up from static electricity on their arms, and they felt like that. One described it as standing inside of a suit filled with pins and needles that were poking their skin. So as they woke up, they went and they noticed that this was coming from the water, not from the sky, and that they could see this lighted up object swimming towards them, towards the shore. And as it got closer and closer, it became larger and larger. They described it as a monster fish, 150 feet long. It had a head that looked like a walrus and 6 eyes the size of dinner plates. At intervals of about every 8 feet, from its head to the tail, there were substances that appeared like copper rings. And this seemed to be where the electrical powerful currents were coming from. What was even more bizarre, they tend to have antennae or horns on the top of its head in which steam, a blue steam, hissed and appeared out of the antennae of this swimming monster. Well, one of the men went down close to get a better view, and this is usually not the thing you want to do. If you were here and heard Travis Walton speak as he ran underneath the spacecraft, and his friends told him not to do that, well, one of the hunters ran towards it, and as he did, this beast turns toward the shore, and out of its antennae, it shot a long stream of this hot electrical steam and knocked him over. The second man went to recover his friend, and he was knocked over and stunned also. The rest of the men ran into the forest and waited until the beast left and began swimming away to go and they thought their friends were dead, but they found out that they were only stunned and were able to recover. This story was published in the Tacoma Daily Ledger in July the 3rd, 1893. And what's interesting about it was some of the description sounds very much like Jules Verne's Captain Nemo and the Nautilus, which was published in French in 1869 and in English in 1873. Well, this took place about 20 years after the book was published here in the United States. I think I'm getting a little bit close to the time that I need to end. So we'll end with, in 1896 and in 1897, there seemed to be a mass sightings across the western part of the United States of unusual flying objects. Now, airplanes hadn't really taken place. The Transcontinental Railroad had just been completed. And so for people to describe these kinds of things in those days would be very unusual. But airships were spotted from Sacramento, California to San Francisco, all the way up into Oregon and Washington. And on some occasions, there were people or aliens, human-like creatures described or seen. In November 25th of that year in Lodi, California, a Colonel G. Shaw and Camille Spooner saw 3 very tall beings standing alongside the road. In the distance behind them was a huge cigar-shaped UFO that hovered quietly over a body of water. According to the Stockton Evening Mail, he described them as looking at 3 strange beings that resembled humans in every respect, except that they were not like anything I had ever seen. They were possessed of a strange and indescribable beauty. They wore no clothes, but their bodies were covered with a soft, fine fuzz, and they were 7 feet in height, very slender. I further noticed that their hands were quite small and delicate. Their fingers were without nails, and their feet were nearly twice as long as those of an ordinary man. They were very narrow with toes that were long and slender, much the same as a monkey. He said, in fact, they appeared to have much better use of their feet than their hands. Their faces and heads were without hair, the ears were small, and the nose had an appearance of polished ivory, while the eyes were large and lustrous. The mouth, however, was very small, and it seemed to me they were without teeth. They also seemed to be very light. They came over and he shook hands with one, and he said, as he shook his hands, he nearly lifted the being off the ground. He says, as far as I could judge, he weighed less than an ounce. He said, when he began to talk to them, they began to warble like birds. He began to ask them where they were from, and one of them talked to the other one, and it seemed like they were going to try and abduct the colonel. But when the alien tried to lift him up, he couldn't. He was too heavy for the alien to lift. And after several attempts of the 3 of them trying to lift the colonel, they decided to give up, I guess. He said, although I made not the slightest resistance, he could not move me. And finally, the 3 of them tried without the slightest success. They appeared to have no muscular power outside of being able to move their own limbs. So they went back to their spacecraft. He said it was about 150 feet in length and probably not over 20 feet in diameter at the widest part. It was pointed at both ends and had a large rudder. Other than that, there was no visible machinery. The men or beings they seemed to glide as they walked, sometimes not even touching the ground. They walked rapidly towards their ship, not as you and I walk, but with a swaying motion. Said they followed them very rapidly as possible, but they reached the bridge and they got on their ship, seemed to spring into the machine, a door opened at the side, and they disappeared within. The ship went through the air very rapidly, expanded and contracted with muscular motion, and soon was out of sight. So many of these mysterious airships appeared all over the west coast of the United States in 1896, and then farther inland in 1897. As mysteriously as they appeared, in the middle of 1897, there were no more sightings or things recorded in the newspaper about it. So these are early stories that Mr. Torres has gathered together from doing research from old newspaper articles, museum archives, microfilm, which some libraries still have. And he collected those and put them into a book that he has called The Real Cowboys and Aliens. If you'd like to read more about some of the encounters of our early Western ancestors and our forefathers, you can talk to Mr. Torres and find out how you can get a copy of this book. So I hope you enjoyed some of these stories, and I hope that the rest of our conference, that it will be very enjoyable to you. I know we have a lot of very well-known, well-written, and well-respected UFO researchers and paranormal people that will be coming to speak to you, and I thank you for being here tonight and listening to me. So thank you.